everyone! Today we're going to talk about research methods. So, what we're going to do in this online lecture is first start out with a little bit of background, like why is it important for us to know anything about research methods? And then I'm going to talk to you about three main types of research methods and just kind of give you the rundown on each one so that you're a little bit familiar with them. I think it'll be really helpful as we go through the rest of the quarter. Okay, so why is it even important to understand research methods in child development? Well, for one, it's important to understand the underlying principles of development. So all these things, all these theoretical things about children, all of that has been discovered through research. So maybe you wondered why babies start to walk at around age 1 or start to talk at around age 1. All of that, we know that there are norms surrounding that because of research. So leading into that, we know how to recognize patterns of behavior through research methods. So we know that, using my example from before, most children start to say their first words at around age 1. And we know that that's a pattern among most children across the world. So it's pretty easy to see when we're talking about things like walking and talking, but it's a little bit harder to recognize those patterns when they become more idiosyncratic. So sometimes we might say, oh, well, I just know these things because I have a niece and I've seen that my niece does certain things, so that must be the same for all kids. For example, my niece Flora is 7 and she has just mastered a 2-wheel bicycle. Good for her, right? Well, I might say then, yeah, all kids who are 7 should be able to ride 2-wheel bicycles. And that might be my observation or my opinion, but that's not really hard evidence. And so if we had research to back it up, if somebody had done a study on what ages kids start to master 2-wheel bicycles, that's a whole lot stronger than me just saying, oh yeah, I saw it in my niece. So in general, what research methods in child development do is explore children's behavior, describe children's behavior, and then explain it. Explain why it is the way it is. So let's just take a look at a couple examples that I found on the internet. So one is from a Time magazine article, and I saw this coming through my news feed once. And this article is about the long-term effects of spanking. And then if you just look at the tagline, it says, a multi-year study shows that spanking kids makes them more aggressive later on. These are big claims, right? So in looking at this, you know that they're doing some kind of study, and it says a multi-year study. So you know that they must have surveyed these parents or done some kind of tests with the families over multiple years of time. So it's important to understand how they gather this information so that we know if it's valid or not. Let's take a look at another one. You guys might see stuff like this on the internet sometimes too if you're browsing around or in your Facebook feed. This one's from NPR, National Public Radio. They put a story up that says, for the children's sake, put down that smartphone. Now this one doesn't have a tagline, but we can imagine that they're going to cite some kind of research that says smartphones and tablets are detrimental to children's development. And in this case, from the picture, it looks like the parents are ignoring the children to look at their devices. So it's a pretty big claim, and you'd hope that it was backed up by some substantial research and not just somebody's opinion. Let's just look at one more. Okay, so this one says, kids of helicopter parents are sputtering out. Sputtering out. That sounds like a pretty big claim as well. And then the tagline says, recent study suggests that kids with over-involved parents and rigidly structured childhoods suffer psychological blowback in college. So, this is also a pretty big claim, and you can imagine that they did some kind of study behind this to show that there is this psychological blowback. I don't know what psychological blowback is, but I imagine that is something pretty rough. When you're reading these stories, it's easy to just take what these claims are at face value, but I'd rather you didn't. I'd rather you have the equipment and the tools and the knowledge to be able to read an article like this and say, hey, you know what? That's not valid. Or read it and say, yeah, okay, this looks like a pretty valid study. I'm going to take this into account. And maybe if it's a study about something that you're going to implement in your classroom, say it's the smartphones article. Maybe you read an article and it says something negative about smartphones. It might influence whether or not you want to have tablets in your classroom with children. Just an example. Just an example. Okay. So you guys might have seen this in science class back in the day. Let's just do a little refresher on the scientific method. This is the process by which all scientific research takes place. So it starts out at the top with this big blue bubble that says ask a question, any kind of question you want. So maybe the kind of question you want to ask is, does candy make students get better grades in school? Let's just say that, huh? And so you want to do some research. You want to maybe, give some students some candy and then give other students no candy and see who's getting better grades. And so you might have a hypothesis. You might say, yeah, the students who I give candy get really, really better grades in school than the ones who don't. That's what I predict. A hypothesis is your prediction. So you want to test it with an experiment. So you might set it all up where you give some kids candy and some kids not and see what happens. And so you get some kind of data, you get some kind of results in there, and you take a look at them and you see if your hypothesis is true or false. You might have to go back and do it again a few more times, and when you're done, you report your results. So that's kind of the general scientific method. And there are a couple of different ways that you might want to gather your data. Or you might want to use this to kind of gather ideas for what your study would be about. So if I was doing my candy study, this part, I don't know if you can see my laser pointer, but this yellow bubble that says research here, you might want to do some kind of background. You might want to think like, hey, is there anything I know about this candy and kids topic already? And so that's when you're doing this gathering information. And there are a couple different ways you could do it. You could do naturalistic observation. So you could just observe children in their natural environments and start to think about things. And honestly, this is what I was doing when I was a preschool teacher all the time, and I just didn't really know it. I was watching my kids and I was thinking, gee, why are they doing the things that they're doing? Why are they putting the puzzle together the way that they did? Why are they getting frustrated when learning how to tie the shoes? What's that all about, you know? So just kind of observing and thinking about research questions. And then you can also do a case study, which is a little bit more focused. That's when you really have a purpose for what you're doing and you're accounting of the behavior of just one specific child. So usually you're doing it, you could be doing it in a lab where you ask a kid to come in and fill out a bunch of tests, or you could be doing it in the school. It's just kind of a more focused way to look at just one kid. So then you've got your ideas for a study. Oh, here you go. These are the two definitions of the thing I just said. Good thing it's a video so you can pause it to see the things now. All right. So the first kind of study I want to talk about is a correlational study. Correlational study is just measuring relationships between two things. So I might be measuring the relationship between candy and happiness with school. Maybe I give you candy and I see, measure if it's happiness with school. And it's measured by this thing called a correlation coefficient. Don't let that term freak you out. All it is a number that ranges from -1 to 1. And it just represents a relationship between two variables, between two things. And it can be a positive relationship or it can be a negative relationship. So in case you're lost thinking about this coefficient and this negative number, let's just not get caught up in that and just think of an example. Okay? So let's think of the example of intelligence and achievement. So there are a lot of studies that measure kids' IQ, and they want to see if somebody's IQ has anything to do with their achievement. So if you test for an IQ, do you also get good grades? So this is a graph with that imaginary data in mind. And this is different imaginary data, not intelligence and IQ, but the example rings true as well. So imagine on the x-axis, on the bottom one down there, it says time spent studying. So let's imagine that's time spent studying 0 hours, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, or 5 hours. And then on the y-axis, the other one, it says grades in school. And it also goes from 0 to 5. So all this is saying is that there's a positive correlation between the time you spent studying and what your grade is in school. So if a kid spends 2 hours studying, they're going to get a grade of 2 in school. Imagine what a grade of 2 is. I don't know, maybe it's a F, D, maybe it's a C in school. So that's just a positive correlation. It could go the other way too. It could be a negative correlation. Probably not with time spent studying, but think about this. What if a kid gets in trouble a lot? What if they're doing a lot of bad things? What if they're skipping school or smoking cigarettes or stealing cars or who knows what delinquent acts or kids are up to these days? So imagine that if you do 0 delinquent acts, look at that, your grades in school are at a 4. So those are high grades in school. But then the minute you do 1 delinquent act, oh, your grades in school start dropping to a 3. And if you do more delinquent acts, the more delinquent acts you do, the worse your grades are. We don't know why, but we can just say that there's a relationship between those two variables. And this one's a negative relationship. So this one would be the -1 relationship. So what's important to note before we move on, that in correlation, you don't know what caused it. You have no idea what caused it. It's just a relationship between two things. We don't know if it's the delinquent act that caused it, or maybe it's something else that's going on at home. Maybe this kid's parents are getting divorced, and that's why they can't concentrate in school, and so they're doing bad things to kind of act out. You don't know. That's not measured in the correlate. All you can look at are delinquent acts and grades in school. So that's when we come to experimentation. Experimentation gives you a lot more insight into cause and effect relationships. So that's what an experiment is. It's a method that you're looking at to try to uncover these cause and effect relationships. And it has all these different components to it. An experiment has a lot of different pieces. And this is going to remind you of that scientific method picture I showed you a little bit ago. So first you got a hypothesis. That's your proposition. That's what you're guessing is going to happen. So let's say let's think about my candy study. How about? So let's say I think that students who get candy are more likely to pay attention in class. How about that? So what I need to do, that's my hypothesis. So what I need to do is look at my independent variable and my dependent variable. What are those two things? Well, the independent variable is something that I'm setting up. It's something that's manipulated by the researcher, the experimenter. That's me. So I'm going to manipulate giving candy out. I'm going to give candy to some people, and I'm going to give no candy to some other people. So I teach child development on Mondays and Wednesdays. Maybe I give my Monday class candy, and then I don't give my Wednesday class candy, and I see who pays more attention in class. Don't worry, I'm not really going to do this. And the dependent variable is tested at the end. It's some kind of measurable outcome. So in my pretend study, I would measure how many students are paying attention. Maybe I would count how many people are looking at their phones versus how many people are paying attention, and then I'll see which was more successful, the candy group or the no candy group. And so then in turn, I've also got two groups, the experimental group and the control group. So the experimental group is the one who gets the treatment. The control group, those are the ones who don't get the treatment. Those are the ones that get no candy. Okay, so the last kind of study I want to tell you about is longitudinal research. So longitudinal research is just observing the same people at multiple time points. So it's measuring change over time, and it can go over months or decades. So one good example of this is measuring the effect of poverty on academic achievement. So you might measure children's poverty levels when they're at age, say, 2 years, and then take a look at their school grades in kindergarten. Oh, they probably don't get grades in kindergarten. In first grade, and second grade, and third grade, and fifth grade. And see if there's any sort of a change, or if there's any sort of a relationship. So that's it might hint to you that this is also a correlational type of research. You can't set up an experiment where you make some kids grow up in poverty and some kids not. That would be totally not ethical. So that is all I have for you for today. Thank you for taking the time to take a look at this, and I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.